Hello and welcome to our Syxsense June Patch Tuesday webinar. Today, we have our industry expert, Rob Brown, here to give us an inside look into the newest Patch Tuesday releases. If you have any questions, please add them to the chat and Rob will reach out after to answer those. And with that, I'll pass things over to Rob Brown.
Thank you, Johanna, and a very warm welcome to everyone joining us today for the June Patch Tuesday. It's halfway through the year. We had a very strange Patch Tuesday, strangely because it was very small, but although not as large as we used to, we do actually have quite a lot of things to cover today. And to help you build a patching strategy if you haven't already got one, we're going to build upon over 20 years of experience of designing patching strategies, and I'll give you some insights on how we do it for our customers all over the world. First thing I would like you to do is to look at your watch. If your watch has a date, if you're not wearing a watch like me, look at your phone. We have been covering the end of life for Windows for a little while now, and Windows 10 21H2, which is the precursor to 22H2, is now end of life. So as of yesterday, there are no more updates available for 21H2. That is now officially obsolete. There are no more updates. You must upgrade to Windows 10 22H2, which is the last and final version of Windows 10 Windows servicing. If you haven't already started, please do that straight away. If you are a Syxsense customer and you want some assistance, do get in contact. We'll provide some excellent help from the customer success team. If you're not a Syxsense customer, but you're using other tool sets, get in contact anyway. We can provide our knowledge and experience on how to do it. Depending on what tool you've got, we might be using PowerShell or something else. If you're on 22H2 Windows 10 Enterprise, you do have until the 14th of October 2025. So literally a year and a couple of months, you will have to move to Windows 11. Windows 11 23H2 has support all the way to 2026, so we don't have to worry about that. Windows Server 2012 is in the second year of ESU extension, and that will finally come to an end on the 10th of October 2026, when Windows 2012 will be obsolete and you'll have to move to another server operating system. Everything I've mentioned doesn't include any long-term servicing branches, so if you're using LTSB, LTSC, Windows 10 or Windows 11, you have plenty of time. I think you have till 2030 before you have to worry about moving off that operating system. We did have a Google 0 day, and this is actually interesting because we've had certainly far less, maybe even half as many Google vulnerabilities weaponized this year as we had last year. Last year was a record. This particular vulnerability is a 0 day or O day. Chrome version 125.0.6422.112 and 113 is for Windows, and the same version is for Linux. That vulnerability is solved in CVE 2024-5274. Google is saying that this particular vulnerability exists in the wild. All right, now, like I mentioned, we do have a rather small Patch Tuesday. In fact, probably the smallest I think we've had of the year. 1 critical only, 47 important. Although last month and the month before that, we had the highest number of fixes ever since the beginning of Patch Tuesday, we still have more in this release that are likely to be weaponized. Luckily, none actually are at this time. So on the 12th of June, none are currently weaponized. That can change and sometimes does change very, very quickly. There are no public aware vulnerabilities, and there are 2 vulnerabilities with a jump point. This is one of those factors we like to build into a patching strategy. If there are jump points available, then it may be part of your selection criteria for your patching strategy. A jump point basically means that you can exploit the original bug and move laterally within the operating system or the application. So, for example, if the vulnerability that you exploit is in hypervisor for Windows 11, then potentially you can jump from the guest to the host or the host to the guest. Imagine what could happen if you could move like that within a particular exploit. There are two vulnerabilities that solve jump points, and on the CVSS score, that's called a scope. So if you're following CVSS, it's called a scope, and that's where the scope is changed. Now, we also had the first time ever only 4 bug types fixed in a Patch Tuesday. And we have a new leader this month with elevation of privilege. Elevation of privilege, there were 23 fixes for this one. That's where a threat actor gains access to an employee's account, bypasses the proper authorization channel, and successfully grants themselves access to data they're not supposed to have. Sort of stealing data or brute force, that kind of thing. Remote code execution vulnerability, on the other hand, is usually the most serious, and this actually has taken a number 2 spot this month with 18 fixes. That's a class of cyber attack in which attackers remotely execute commands to place malware or other malicious code on your computer or network. Bear in mind, the remote code execution vulnerability is the most serious kind of vulnerability. It may be the second part, it may be the second selection criteria for a patching strategy, especially if you're considering a vulnerability that looks similar with an elevation of privilege and a remote code execution. You should probably choose the remote code execution vulnerability over everything else. We have 4 denial of service vulnerabilities, vulnerability fixes. That's an attack meant to shut down a machine or network, making it inaccessible. And then 3 information disclosure vulnerabilities. 3 of these when a program unintentionally reveals sensitive information, such as a memory leak where you can grab passwords or code that's going through CPU or through the RAM. We didn't have any feature bypass vulnerabilities, and we didn't have any spoofing either. It's the first time I've ever seen only 4 bug fixes in a release, potentially because 21H2 went end of life, possibly. I'm very nervous that the numbers are so low and the number of fixes by bug type is tremendously low, and I've never seen this before. So I would pay very close attention to an out of band update that could happen at any time. Microsoft may be still going through testing. They may release these out of band. If that's the case, we will let you know on a future release to our website. Now, if you're a Syxsense customer, well, you can prioritize your strategy using these 6 factors. If you're not a Syxsense customer, it is okay. I'm going to show you how you use this information to whatever tool set you're using and how to make the best, most informed decision. The way that we prioritize patches at Syxsense within managed services, we deploy over 1 million patches every single month. We use the vendor severity and the CVSS score as a better selection of the severity of a vulnerability. You combine these two and you have the vendor severity, which usually starts off at critical, high, or important, medium, low, and NA, from the very worst to the least. And then you have a CVSS score, which is an independently scored calculation from 10 to 0, 10 being the very worst, 0 being not actually vulnerable at all in terms of a security risk. And if you combine the two, they actually have matching severity. So there's critical on the vendor, there's a critical on the CVSS, there's a high on the vendor, there's a high on the CVSS. And if you combine the two, you'll actually find, as we're going to see in a few moments, you will see overlaps. Maybe the vendor thinks it's not such a big risk, they'll downgrade it to an important vulnerability. For the CVSS, on the other hand, when they use that calculator, which is very good, it's able to specifically calculate the effort that goes in to making it exploitable, kind of permissions and how close you have to be to the target device, and it comes out with a very, very granular score from 10. So 10, 9.9, 9.8, 9.7. It's very, very good. It does give you a better impression of the risk, especially if you combine the two. Next, we've got the state of the vulnerability, and these are two well-known states called weaponized. That's also called under active attack. Sometimes it's called exploited. We've been using this name for a very, very long time. Weaponized means that through our partners or through our vendors that we support here at Syxsense, we've been told or we've been alerted that a particular CVE is being used in an attack somewhere around the world. And those particular vulnerabilities could be exploited in your environment, and sometimes those vulnerabilities have a less than critical vendor severity or less than critical CVSS score. And that's why you want to balance the severity against the state of the vulnerability. So weaponized is very, very serious. Luckily for this month, we don't have any weaponized, but given that we've had such a tiny release, I would keep an eye on the 0-day and the outer band that might happen in the next couple of weeks. Public aware doesn't mean that I'm telling you about the vulnerability right now. It's actually somebody has published the exact methodology, the exact blueprint to exploit this vulnerability. So they may have provided a YouTube video or a bug bounty program that's very good at Google, is actually explaining how a vulnerability could be used in an exploit. Now, if they provide the exact steps and examples on how to exploit a vulnerability, there are some bad actors that potentially will try to use that information to exploit. When you have a weaponized vulnerability and a public aware, you're supercharging the CVE, and that is why we like to have both of these as a selectable option for you. Public aware does not mean it becomes or guarantees that it becomes weaponized. Just be clear, there are a lot of public aware vulnerabilities that actually never get weaponized. Now, to balance this score, we have a countermeasure, and especially since COVID, everyone is now moving home. There's hugely distributed networks around the world for our customers, and they're supporting offices all across America and across the UK. It may be easier to deploy a countermeasure than it actually deploying the patch, especially since Microsoft is now accumulating lots of updates into a single binary. That binary potentially could be 1.5 gigabytes. So having a countermeasure available allows you to do something to mitigate the vulnerability, and we actually include that information inside Syxsense. So if a countermeasure exists, it could be a mitigation. So it might be you have a next generation antivirus. It might be the service isn't running and therefore you're not vulnerable, such as Windows Defender, the antivirus. Maybe you're not using Windows Defender, so the antivirus does not need to be patched. But then you've got workarounds, and these are opportunities to deploy group policy or registry keys that can be done much, much quicker using Syxsense than the traditional deployment of a patch. So if you can set a registry key that mitigates the vulnerability or offers a countermeasure, then we would highly recommend you do that, especially if that can be done very quickly and you can then plan your deployment of patches in your standard fashion. Always please take a note. If you are applying a countermeasure, then you do need to make sure you read the notes from Microsoft or from the vendor to see if you need to remove the countermeasure after you've applied the update. If it's recommending you apply a registry key, don't leave the registry key there if you don't need to. That is actually how a future exploit can occur, and obviously all that unused registry keys can just become a clutter and a mess on your PC. Finally, all that information is fantastic, but if you are not exposed in your environment, then you have nothing to worry about. Your exposure is one of your most important factors when prioritizing patches. If you take your severity, the weaponized and public aware status with countermeasure into consideration. Search through your environment against your exposure. Any of these devices in your environment that is missing vulnerabilities, fixes with these 6 factors, the higher your exposure, the quicker you should deploy them. And if you find that you have a lot of vulnerabilities you need to fix, consider using a phased rollout of patches. So you could say phase 1, which is the critical, the weaponized. Phase 2 could be the high and public aware, that kind of thing. So phase it out because some of these will require reboots and we don't want to disrupt the user too much. Now, let's go take a look at actually the Patch Tuesday analysis. And I have actually enjoyed this Patch Tuesday because not only am I delivering this Patch Tuesday webinar, I am actually able to research a lot of things about Windows that I did not know before. So we're going to go over to our website, which is Syxsense.com. If you're in the UK, it's syxsense.co.uk. And basically, you've got the resources section along the top that you can, if you wish, go ahead and check out any events or webinars that we have in the future. You've got our news page, our blogs, and all of our white papers on all of our recommendations of patch testing, patch strategy, etc. If you have any questions, or if you are looking for something very specific, use the chat function in the corner there. Doesn't hurt, just send a message. Can I have a document? They'll send it to you if we already have it. If you have a specific question or you want to speak to me, use the chat function again. They'll give you my email address. If you would like to book a demo to see how Syxsense can help, use the button in the corner. If you use the resources page, we're going to go straight back to the webinar now. We're going to use the resources page. You'll find under the events, the June Patch Tuesday write-up. And we actually published this on Tuesday evening here in the UK. So that's early afternoon in the US, where we are already recommending a lot of these updates for priority. A lot of our managed services customers have enjoyed the slightly earlier emails that we send to them as well. Now, we do have 48 fixes. One of them was a CVSS score of 9.8. If you remember, out of 10, that makes this the highest rated severity of the list. But let's go into it. Now, we did have quite a lot of fixes from Windows, components, Office, especially Office, Azure, .NET Framework, Visual Studio. Now, a lot of these updates are sort of standard issue, but there's an awful lot less that we had this month. Even so, when I calculate all the CVSSs up for all of the vulnerabilities we had yesterday, we actually only had a score of 349.2, which I expected because we had far less vulnerabilities than we did last month. However, the average number of CVSS score compared to last month was higher. So although we had less fixes, the average number of fixes that were in this release was 7.3, which actually was up on last month, which was 7.1. Just to give you an idea that a lot of the vulnerabilities that have been fixed this month are substantial and are more important than last month. Now, I also, if you're regular to this to the channel, I normally make 3 recommendations, and I talk about 3 particular vulnerabilities I'd ask you to prioritize. This month, I'm going to talk about 4 because one of them I just couldn't not talk about. The first one, most important one, CVE 2024-30080. That's a Microsoft message queuing remote code execution vulnerabilities. Remote code execution vulnerability, one of the most serious ones. Now, there's a lot of misconception about the Microsoft message queuing because it's assumed that this is an email type system. Actually, the message queuing system, which is a Windows component, is actually used in the infrastructure and development. It's an infrastructure and development tool used by Windows to send messages. And it can send messages without the need to know the results of whether or not those messages have been received. And it's designed for Windows in a variety of scenarios, for example, financial services. So ensuring messages are delivered for electronic commerce. So you just send out the messages, but you don't need to know if it's been received or not. And also at airports. So this is very interesting. So when you ever see your bags go through at airports, you'll notice they get scanned. And basically that scanner is sending the message to the server that receives it. It doesn't care if it receives it or not, but actually it's used more often than you think. Now, it is a reliable delivery system, and it places messages into a status that allows it to keep trying to send it until the destination is reachable. So it doesn't care that it failed. It will keep trying to send it until those messages have been received. There are a number of reasons why message queuing is enabled, and in your organization, you might not think this is the case. However, I would highly recommend to check that you do or do not have it installed on your servers. You can tell if you are listening to port TCP port 1801. If that is open, you probably have the message queuing service running. If the service is running, you're vulnerable. Microsoft is saying that this is more likely to be exploited as well, and obviously carries the CVSS score of 9.8, as I mentioned. Now, the countermeasure, of course, if you don't have message queuing service started, you're not vulnerable, so that's good. But the risk is quite high. It can be exploited over any network, including the internet, with low attack complexity, no privileges at all, and no user interaction. So very serious. Make sure you get that patched. The next one is 2024-30064. This is a Windows kernel elevation of privilege vulnerability. The Windows kernel, if you're used to Linux and other operating systems like Mac OS, you'll know what the kernel is. If you're in Windows, kernel is the operating system. It is the central nervous system of the Windows operating system. Now, an attacker who successfully exploited this vulnerability could gain unauthorized access to system resources, potentially allowing them to perform actions with the same privileges as the compromised process. And this could lead to further system compromise and unauthorized actions within the network, i.e. this is your jump point I mentioned earlier. So if they were able to exploit this particular vulnerability, they could leave some breadcrumbs that would allow them to further break into your environment at a future date. The risk is not as high as the previous vulnerability because you do have a local attack vector. I mean, you need to be on the network. You need to be within the network in order to exploit this. It cannot be done across the internet. It does have low attack complexity, low privileges, no user interaction. As I mentioned, it does have a jump point. Very, very serious. My third, although not third in criticality, it is as critical as the second. It's 2024-30078. This is your Windows Wi-Fi driver remote code execution vulnerability. That remote code execution vulnerability is back here. This is what's used in ransomware attacks. And Wi-Fi is very popular. I know a lot of people are using Wi-Fi, even in your offices. Let me explain why this is extremely serious and was kind of making the hair on my arm stuck up a little bit when I was reading the info on this one. Now, an authenticated attacker could send a malicious networking packet to an adjacent system that is employing a Wi-Fi networking adapter, which could enable remote code execution. So let me just break this down for you. If you have a device in an airport, maybe in a coffee shop, and you are publishing that Wi-Fi point, you are likely to find somebody will want to use it. All that they need to do is to search for a Wi-Fi point, and that potentially is enough to actually make your system under active attack. It impacts every operating system. So every single operating system from Microsoft that is currently supported is potentially vulnerable, and it's very, very serious. Now, it requires an adjacent network. Now, what does that mean? It means they don't actually need you to be on their network. So this is an attack coming from their device to your device. So simply by asking, is there any available Wi-Fi hotspots, is enough to actually exploit that. Is extremely important. If you have mobile users, laptops, please make this your absolute priority. Let's get it patched. Even though they may be on lockdown and they're not allowed to use Wi-Fi hotspots that aren't tested by you, the fact that they are broadcasting and looking for Wi-Fi hotspots potentially is enough to actually exploit your machine. Please prioritize this one. And lastly, also as important, I actually chose 4, but I really only have 2 priorities. The first one and these 3 is CVE 2024-30103. This is a Microsoft Outlook remote code execution vulnerability, again used in ransomware attacks. An attacker who successfully exploited this vulnerability could bypass Outlook registry block lists and enable the creation of malicious DLLs. Let me unpack that for a second, what that means. Outlook is able to create files on your PC, and if they were able to exploit this, they could create a DLL on your system that by itself doesn't look very dangerous. Then in a future attack, that DLL becomes active. Maybe that DLL is a program, maybe there's a couple of DLLs. Now, of course, we're not talking about sending DLLs via email. That would be blocked by your antivirus. But if a website was to be created and you simply accessed, an email came into your system that looked like it wasn't real, if you, like me, use the preview pane and looked at the email, it potentially can go and grab this DLL from a website and pop it onto your computer. So the preview pane is an attack vector. You probably are using preview panes, as I do, for efficiency. You want to look at the email, you want to block it, you want to delete it, or you want to reply and respond. Simply looking at these emails is enough to take that email and to then to create those malicious DLLs. By themselves, they are not actually able to exploit something on your PC, but at a future date, you may have enough of these compromised DLLs that a sophisticated attack could be used to exploit your system. Please, if you're using Outlook, and I'm sure everyone here is, and I think the last time we looked, there's over 500 people that look at our webinar on Patch Tuesday day. Please make sure you prioritize Outlook, this Outlook update, and there are unfortunately no countermeasures at all, so you do need to apply the update. It can the risk factor is very high. It can be exploited over any network, including the internet, low attack complexity, low privileges by the user, no interaction whatsoever by the user. They can be exploited. So please, there are 4 here, but I'm actually only asking you to prioritize 2, the first one and these 3. Please make sure those get deployed as urgently as possible. As I promised, all of the CVEs from this Patch Tuesday are inside this table. Take the CVE in priority from top to bottom. Take the CVE from here, copy it, put it into your tool set. If your environment is highly detected, then go ahead and put that into a deployment. Deploy as many as you can in those phases. If you don't have a high-speed network, or you have a highly distributed network with lots and lots of devices, go ahead and use those phases to make it a bit easier. I really hope that was useful. Hey, if you are at Black Hat in a couple of months' time, do stop by the Syxsense booth. If you have a second, go to the chat, send us a message. If you would like a Black Hat voucher, we'd be delighted to send you something, and we really look forward to seeing you. Thank you for joining me today. I really hope that this has been useful, and I look forward to seeing you again in July. And until next time, happy patching.